In 2025, more than 15,000 children under the age of 13 were arrested across the United States. This staggering number is not a one-off anomaly. It's part of a persistent trend. Over the past 2 decades, more than 250,000 children under 13 have been arrested in the US, with many facing charges ranging from theft to assault, and in the most severe cases, murder. This data highlights a sobering reality that even as overall juvenile crime has declined since the turbulent 1990s, arrests involving the youngest children have remained alarmingly consistent. Between 2022 and 2025, the United States saw a disturbing uptick in youth violence, with children under the age of 13 becoming increasingly involved in serious crimes, especially murder. This shift came as a shock to many, particularly following decades of steady decline in juvenile crime. In 2022 alone, juvenile arrests for murder rose by 12%, and by 2025, over 50 children under 13 were arrested for homicide. These aren't just statistics, they're a stark warning that youth violence is evolving into something more volatile and unpredictable. When we think of juvenile crime, we often picture young boys. This is no coincidence. Historically, males have accounted for the overwhelming majority of violent crimes committed by juveniles. However, recent trends show that the gap between male and female juvenile offenders is gradually narrowing. In 2023, 85% of juveniles involved in violent crimes were male, with females accounting for only 15%. This stark disparity can be attributed to a combination of biological, psychological, and social factors that influence how boys and girls develop and respond to their environments. Biologically, boys tend to exhibit higher levels of aggression and risk-taking behavior due to hormonal differences, particularly testosterone. Socially, boys are often encouraged to be dominant, assertive, and unafraid to use force, while girls are typically socialized to be nurturing and passive. These societal expectations heavily influence their behavior, especially during adolescence, when many children begin to test boundaries. However, the trend of male dominance in juvenile crime does not mean girls are unaffected by violence. While still fewer in number, the incidence of female juvenile offenders has been increasing over the past decade, with female delinquency rising by 5% in that time. Historically, girls' crimes were often less violent or more emotionally driven, but this has changed in recent years. Girls are increasingly engaging in violent crimes like assaults, stabbings, and even murders, often fueled by trauma, abuse, or bullying. A notable case is that of Tiffany James, a 14-year-old girl from New Orleans who was arrested after stabbing a boy who had been bullying her for months. Tiffany's actions were not just out of anger, but out of desperation, a cry for help after years of abuse at home. These gender differences is crucial in developing more targeted intervention programs. While the vast majority of juvenile offenders are male, the rising number of female offenders demands equal attention to their unique challenges. When we look deeper into the statistics, a troubling pattern emerges in racial and ethnic disparities in juvenile crime. In the year 2023 alone, these disparities were glaring. But what do these numbers really mean? And why do certain racial groups, particularly African American children, seem involved in juvenile offenses? In 2023, juvenile delinquency offenses involved 8,285 white juveniles, 13,200 for black juveniles, 5,536 Hispanic juveniles, 537 American Indian juveniles, 251 Asian juveniles, and 724 juveniles of more than one race. These numbers indicate a stark reality. African American juveniles, who make up around 14% of the US population, are involved in nearly 40% of delinquency offenses. Meanwhile, white juveniles, representing about 60% of the US population, make up just over 30% of juvenile offenses. The Hispanic population follows suit, showing an involvement rate proportional to their population size, but still significantly higher than Asian and American Indian juveniles. The reasons for these racial and ethnic disparities are multifaceted. Economic inequality, historical disadvantages, and systemic issues such as poverty, underfunded schools, and limited access to mental health resources all contribute to these troubling figures. African American and Hispanic communities are often disproportionately affected by the cycle of violence, poverty, and a lack of opportunity. One of the most alarming trends in recent years has been the increasing role of firearms in juvenile violence. Guns are now the weapon of choice in many juvenile homicides, and their accessibility to children has contributed significantly to the surge in violent crimes committed by young people. In 2022, nearly 45% of juvenile homicides involved firearms. This marks a staggering rise compared to previous decades, where knives or blunt objects were more commonly used. The accessibility of guns to juveniles is deeply concerning, especially as children as young as 11 or 12 have been caught with firearms. The question is, how are these young people gaining access to such deadly weapons? Increased gun ownership across the country has made firearms more available to children and teenagers. Many of these guns are not stored securely, allowing easy access for young people. In some cases, children steal firearms from their parents' homes, as was the case with Dylan Ortiz, a 13-year-old from Los Angeles who used a gun he stole from his father's locked cabinet to kill a classmate in 2020. Additionally, illegal gun markets are thriving, with firearms easily obtainable on the street, often without any background checks. This makes it easier for juveniles to acquire weapons without their parents or guardians being aware. The rising presence of firearms in juvenile crime reflects the broader gun culture in America. As gun ownership has increased, so has the normalization of violence, especially in communities where gang activity is prevalent. For many young people, access to guns becomes a way of feeling powerful or protected in environments where violence is a daily reality. To understand the current state of juvenile crime in the United States, we must look back to a time when America's youth were at the center of a full-blown crisis. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, the nation witnessed an alarming explosion of youth violence. Teenagers and sometimes even preteens were being arrested at record rates for robbery, assault, and murder. In 1995, political scientist John DiIulio coined the term super predator to describe a supposedly new breed of remorseless youth criminals. Media outlets ran with the term, plastering the faces of young black and brown boys across television screens and newspapers. These children were painted as heartless and dangerous, predators lurking in city streets, ready to kill without conscience. What followed was a surge of tough-on-crime policies. Legislators responded with fear and fury, lowering the age at which children could be tried as adults, increasing the length of juvenile sentences, and building more detention facilities to house the growing number of young offenders. The data seemed to back the panic. In 1993 alone, over 1,300 juveniles were arrested for murder, a record-breaking figure. That same year, juveniles accounted for 15% of all murder arrests in the country. Across major cities like Chicago, Los Angeles, and Detroit, gun violence involving youth reached epidemic levels. Gangs, drugs, and weapons were tearing through communities already burdened by poverty and systemic neglect. For many families, sending their child to school became a gamble. Metal detectors were installed in hallways. After-school programs focused more on survival than enrichment. America was frightened, and when fear takes the wheel, compassion gets thrown out the window. But the story wasn't as simple as it appeared on the nightly news. The rise in juvenile crime during this period didn't happen in a vacuum. It was driven by deeper societal shifts like the crack cocaine epidemic, the proliferation of firearms, and the collapse of industrial jobs. Starting in the mid to late 1990s and into the early 2000s, juvenile crime began to fall. Murder arrests for juveniles dropped by nearly 30% by 2005 and continued to decline through the 2010s. The predicted wave of super predators never materialized. In fact, it was debunked by numerous studies and even disavowed by some of its original proponents. By the mid-2010s, it was clear America was no longer facing the youth crime epidemic that had defined the 1990s. In fact, by 2015, juvenile arrest rates were at their lowest levels in for decades. School shootings still made headlines, and violence hadn't disappeared, but the overall numbers showed a nation moving in the right direction. Children were less likely to be involved in violent crimes, less likely to join gangs, and more likely to have access to at least some form of intervention before their behavior spiraled out of control. In some states, progressive reformers even began to reimagine juvenile justice entirely, replacing incarceration with restorative justice programs, peer mediation, and trauma-informed care. Slowly, the narrative around young offenders began to shift from monsters to victims of circumstance. The focus was no longer on retribution, it was on rehabilitation. However, the progress wasn't evenly distributed. While some communities reaped the benefits of investment and reform, others, particularly poor, rural, or heavily policed urban neighborhoods were left behind. The juvenile crime drop also obscured growing racial disparities. Black youth were still far more likely to be arrested, detained, and sentenced harshly compared to their white peers, even for the same offenses. In other words, the system became more sophisticated, but not necessarily more just. When the COVID-19 pandemic swept through the United States in early 2020, it brought with it a wave of instability, fear, and uncertainty. Schools closed, jobs were lost, routines were shattered, and amid all this chaos, a disturbing pattern began to re-emerge: a resurgence in juvenile crime. For nearly 2 decades, America had made strides in reducing youth violence, but as the world shut down, so too did the critical support systems designed to keep children safe, stable, and on track. The result was devastating. What had once been a success story in juvenile crime prevention was now under threat, and the data showed it plainly. Juvenile involvement in violent offenses surged after years of decline. In 2022, juvenile arrests for murder increased by 12% from the previous year. That number might seem small at first glance, but it marked a turning point in a downward trend that had persisted for nearly 30 years. By 2025, over 50 children under the age of 13 were arrested for murder, which was a staggering and deeply troubling figure. These weren't just rare anomalies or isolated incidents. They were symptoms of a deeper unraveling happening within America's youth and the communities they inhabit. More broadly, juveniles accounted for 9.9% of all arrests for violent crimes in 2022, with sharp increases in aggravated assault, gun violence, and group-involved attacks. From 2020 to 2022, juvenile involvement in shootings surged by nearly 30%, with some cities reporting even higher spikes. While juvenile crime had declined over time, the post-pandemic years revealed an uncomfortable truth: the problem never truly went away, it had merely been contained. When the scaffolding of support collapsed, so did the fragile peace. The resurgence in juvenile crime after 2020 cannot be traced to one single cause. Rather, it was the result of multiple intersecting crises, all inflamed by the pandemic. With classrooms shuttered, millions of children were sent home, many to environments that were far from safe. The pandemic pushed millions of families into poverty. Parents lost jobs, rent went unpaid, food insecurity skyrocketed. In this environment of financial desperation, some children turned to crime out of necessity, others out of influence, and still others out of hopelessness. Perhaps the most insidious fallout from the pandemic has been the explosion in mental health issues among youth. Isolation, grief, fear, and uncertainty created a perfect storm for anxiety, depression, and trauma. According to a 2021 report by the US Surgeon General, emergency room visits for mental health crises among children increased by 31% for those aged 12 to 17. Suicidal ideation, self-harm, and emotional dysregulation became more common. Gun sales soared during the pandemic. In 2020 alone, over 8 million firearms were purchased in the US, a 40% increase from the previous year. Many of those weapons made their way into homes, often unsecured and easily accessible to children. Firearms have become the weapon of choice in juvenile homicides. In 2022, nearly 45% of all juvenile murders involved guns. With more weapons in circulation and fewer interventions available, violent altercations escalated faster and deadlier than ever before. An example is the case of Jeremy Miller, a 12-year-old from Chicago. In 2023, Jeremy was arrested for the murder of a fellow classmate during a gang-related dispute. Born into a neighborhood plagued by gun violence and economic despair, Jeremy had witnessed more death in his short life than many adults ever will. At home, Jeremy's situation was even worse. His mother battled addiction. His father had been absent since infancy. There were no mentors, no programs, no escape routes. Jeremy's pain went unnoticed until it exploded into tragedy. What makes Jeremy's story even more tragic is how common it has become. In neighborhoods across the country, children are growing up in conditions that breed trauma, and without intervention, trauma often turns to violence. The post-pandemic rise in juvenile crime has also brought with it a shift in the nature of these offenses. It's not just that more children are getting arrested, it's that the crimes are becoming more brutal, more calculated, and in some cases, more public. Social media has played a role in this. Conflicts that might once have ended in playground arguments now escalate through online taunts and threats, often culminating in violence. Gang recruitment has also shifted to digital platforms, allowing children to be indoctrinated in some cases. Children as young as 10 or 11 are being used as pawns by older criminals, committing crimes under the radar, knowing they'll face more lenient penalties due to their age. More interesting is that this resurgence of violence has put an enormous strain on the already overburdened juvenile justice system. Judges, probation officers, and detention centers are grappling with an influx of cases involving younger and more troubled offenders. Many detention centers lack the resources to provide meaningful rehabilitation, and with schools, mental health clinics, and community programs still playing catch-up after the pandemic, the question becomes, where do we put these kids? Who is going to help them? The answers remain unclear. What's evident, though, is that we're witnessing the fallout of a generation failed by the systems meant to protect them. Mental health issues are a significant, yet often overlooked, factor in juvenile crime. Studies show that more than 60% of juvenile offenders have at least one untreated mental health disorder, with many struggling with conditions such as depression, anxiety, PTSD, and conduct disorders. These untreated issues can manifest in violent behavior, poor decision-making, and an inability to cope with stress or trauma. For many juveniles, their involvement in crime is less about inherent malice and more about a reaction to unresolved psychological distress. Without adequate mental health support, these children often resort to violence as a way to express their frustration or to protect themselves from further harm. Take the case of Jordan Blake, a 14-year-old from Phoenix who was involved in a fatal altercation at school. Jordan had been struggling with depression since the age of 10, following the death of his older brother. Without proper mental health care, Jordan's emotional turmoil grew until it exploded in a violent outburst, tragically ending in another child's death. Unfortunately, mental health resources for juveniles are often scarce or inaccessible. Many children with emotional and psychological issues are not diagnosed early, leaving them to cope in unhealthy ways. The juvenile justice system is starting to recognize the importance of mental health care, but progress is slow. More needs to be done to provide early intervention, access to counseling, and trauma-informed care to prevent future offenses. The debate between rehabilitation and punishment in the juvenile justice system has been a long-standing one. Historically, the system was designed with the goal of rehabilitating young offenders rather than simply punishing them. However, in practice, there has often been a shift toward punitive measures, with an increasing number of juveniles being tried as adults and incarcerated in adult prisons, which can further hinder their chances for reform. The key difference between these two approaches lies in the philosophy behind them. Punishment focuses on retribution, justice, and the deterrence of future crimes, while rehabilitation focuses on helping the young offender understand their behavior, address underlying issues such as trauma or mental illness, and provide them with the tools to reintegrate successfully into society. One example of a rehabilitative approach can be found in the case of Carlos Ramirez, a 17-year-old from Arizona who was sentenced to an adult prison, committing a violent robbery at 15. In the adult prison system, Carlos was subjected to abuse, isolation, and neglect, which only worsened his mental health issues. His story highlights a critical flaw in the system. When juveniles are incarcerated in adult facilities, the trauma they experience often exacerbates their original issues, making it more difficult for them to reform. Conversely, restorative justice programs, mental health counseling, and trauma-informed care are designed to address the root causes of juvenile crime, offering young offenders the chance to heal, learn, and ultimately lead productive lives. These methods focus on prevention, early intervention, and positive behavior reinforcement, aiming to break the cycle of crime rather than perpetuate it. While the push for harsher punishments is understandable, it's clear that rehabilitation offers a far more promising path forward. We need a system that is not only tough on crime, but also tough on the causes of crime: trauma, poverty, mental health struggles, and lack of opportunity. In the shadows of the justice system are children who are lost, some misled, and many simply failed by the very structures meant to protect them. These aren't just cases on paper or numbers on a chart. They're lives that are young, vulnerable, and full of potential. The statistics we've explored tell a deeper story. a story of broken homes, untreated trauma, systemic neglect, and missed opportunities. If we truly want a safer, more just future, then we must shift our focus from punishment to prevention, from incarceration to intervention.